to hear people talk about the topic that we're going to discuss today. We're being recorded, as you can all hear. My name is Maartje van der Woude. I'm professor of law and society at Leiden Law School, and I'm very happy to organize this series of talks, and we'll introduce our upcoming talk after today's session together with Camille Lefebvre, who will be taken over fairly quickly, but because she is in full control of the seminar today. So thank you for being here. I'm just going to give you a couple of practical announcements before Camille will introduce the panel and our esteemed panelists. I would like to ask everybody to mute their microphone to make sure that we don't have any sound interruptions during the presentation. And to please write any question or comment that you have in the chat with a clear indicator to whom to whom you're asking this question by, for instance, saying at Sharry or at Iker or at everybody, so that I can make sure that your question is actually asked. So once again, thank you. And Camille, I'm going to leave it to you to introduce the panel and our speakers.
Thank you so much, Maartje. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Crimmigration Law Talks webinar in partnership with Border Criminologies and the CINETS Network. So as Maartje said, my name is Camille Lefebvre. I'm a PhD student at Leiden University in a joint program at Université Laval in Canada. And today our panel focuses on the criminalization of immigration activism and crimes of solidarity. So our four amazing speakers will talk about the importance of promoting human rights in the refugee and migration context and reflect on the impact of dissuasion techniques and sanctions from states that can impede legal mobilization. So each speaker will have about 15 minutes, and then as Maartje said, we will open the floor for questions that you can write in the chat. So our first speaker is Professor Sharry Aiken at Queen's University's Faculty of Law in Canada with a cross appointment to cultural studies. And we have also Professor Iker Barbero, who is affiliated with the Department of Administrative Law, Constitutional Law, and Philosophy of Law at the University of the Basque Country. We have Professor Witold Klaus, who is affiliated with the Institute of Law Studies at the Polish Academy of Science, and Dr. Agnieszka Kubal, who is lecturer in sociology at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at the University College London. So we will start with Sharry. The floor is yours, and have a great conference, everyone.
Thank you very much, Camille and Maartje, for organizing this conversation. I'm really excited to be with you here today, and I'm going to get started. So I'm talking about the Canadian context and specifically focusing in on refugee mutual aid and solidarity, only because the topic of immigration activism is very big. And I decided to kind of just look at one specific window, and in particular, looking at the perils and prospects of test case litigation, litigating for change in this area. Before beginning though, I'm situated in Canada and I want to share a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge the land on which I'm living and working as an uninvited guest in Toronto or Tekaronto. I acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I am grateful to have the opportunity to research and teach on this land. I'm also grateful to be able to drink a glass of water and not have to boil the water first, which is not something that everyone in this country can say. So, talking about mutual aid, and in particular, framing it as refugee protection from below, drawing on the work of scholar Tekelein, who did some very important ethnographic field work with Eritrean refugees. So we just want to situate these terms very briefly. And indeed, when we sort of theorize and discuss mutual aid, we probably should be going back to the 19th century anarchist Peter Kropotkin, who formulated the theory after going to the Siberian wilderness. Expecting to observe competition in the natural world, he instead witnessed animals united against common struggle. He later outlined his theory of mutual aid in this 1902 essay. If we flash forward about a century, I like to draw on the work of Dean Spade, a legal scholar at the University of Seattle, who defines mutual aid in terms of collective coordination, emphasizing importantly that mutual aid is not really just volunteerism, right? It's about disrupting the structures that oppress people, and it's drawing on a historically connected practice that people have used to survive for centuries. Now, obviously, there's a lot more I can say about mutual aid, but widening our lens a little bit to refugee mutual aid in practice, I'm not going to say anything much about these case studies other than to point to them. And I expect some of my co-panelists may be saying a bit more. But we can frame mutual aid as escape aid when we're talking about refugees. And we can look to Denmark as an example, where some 300 Danish citizens were involved in facilitating the migration of Syrian refugees to reach Stockholm and the possibility of actually pursuing asylum, and noting that these acts were criminalized. People were prosecuted and convicted. Similarly, we can look at the work of No More Deaths, an NGO that's active on both sides of the US-Mexican border. Their work in the Arizona desert resulted in several high-profile prosecutions and convictions, merely for leaving jugs of water and cans of beans in the desert. We can look to as well the work of search and rescue vessels on the Mediterranean. We note that there's been dozens of these boats patrolling the waters. And we know even here in Canada, we hear about the prosecution of people who are captaining these boats, including the very high profile arrest of Carola Rackete, but the prosecution of others as well. And this is continuing. Over to Germany, a country that actually has a fairly generous asylum policy relative to its European neighbors, but there's still a very active movement of escape helpers in Germany. This is a poster from the Peng Collective, and it's interesting to note that, I'm sure I'm going to mangle the pronunciation, but the Fluchthelfers draw from the historical example dating back to East Germany, and have kind of resurrected this activism in terms of trying to help undocumented migrants receive protection in Germany. And once again, these are people who are being prosecuted as a result of this activity. It's interesting to contrast what's going on at the Polish border right now. This activity is not being prosecuted, but it's very much in the same genre of refugee mutual aid. So you have on the one hand a snapshot of volunteers offering cups of coffee and soup, and you have in the top corner a care package from Vietnamese refugees, former Vietnamese refugees living in Poland, some of whom set up food tents at the border and assisted in all kinds of other ways. I think what's interesting here is that we see mutual aid not just something that's participated in by the majority community, but also refugee communities and diaspora active participants in these efforts. Well, what does law have to say about all this? And that's really where I'm going to pivot next. And we're going to start with the migrant smuggling protocol. I don't particularly like this legal instrument. I think it's been abused. But if we take it on its own words, I would point out Article 2, which emphasizes that this instrument actually has two purposes, not just combating organized crime, but protecting the rights of smuggled migrants, right? That's first and foremost embedded into Article 2. And the other thing that's really important to emphasize is that embedded in this instrument is the fact that smuggling is only smuggling when there's a financial or other material benefit involved in the context of organized crime, okay? So that's really important. And on its face, one would think that that would suggest that the cases that we just looked at briefly don't fall within the parameters of this protocol. And yet, if you take a look at what countries are doing around the world, you can see the Palermo protocols being subverted. And Canada is a case in point. Under the leadership of a conservative federal government, these provisions in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act were targeted at refugee mutual aid, right? So you'll note that people smuggling is embedded here. And if you are alleged to have engaged in people smuggling, you become inadmissible. And if you're inadmissible, there is a whole range of consequences. First of all, you're not eligible to make a refugee claim. You have limited access to any legal remedies. You're subject to continued surveillance and reporting. You're barred from reuniting with your family. And most profoundly, you're subject to detention and possible deportation. So those are all the things that happen if you're alleged to have been involved in people smuggling. Furthermore, you can be prosecuted under Canada's immigration law, and you can see the nature of the sentences that are imposed. I'm not going to read it word for word, but we're looking at up to $500,000 fines and terms of imprisonment of up to 10 years for a first offense. And that's if you're involved in helping less than 10 people. If it's more than 10 people, the fine goes up to $1 million and the prospect of life imprisonment. So we really see what messages are being sent. So how are these laws being used in Canada? And I want to turn to two very high profile cases. I'm not going to go into detail, but they were two boats called smuggling ships by the Canadian media and popular discourse. The passengers on these two boats were referred to as illegal migrants, despite the fact that they were all fleeing armed conflict in Sri Lanka. The first one was the Ocean Lady that arrived off the west coast of Canada in 2009. And the next one was the Sunsea, which arrived almost a year later. There were groups of passengers on both of these boats who were slapped with inadmissibility as a result of people smuggling or human smuggling, and charged with human smuggling pursuant to Section 117 of Canada's immigration law. So while this is going on, by the way, just to put this in a bit of perspective, Sri Lanka is still in the throes of massive human rights violations. So even 5 years after these boats arrived, Human Rights Watch is reporting the persistence of serious human rights problems, including the widespread practice of torture. I'm not going to read these slides, but I always think when we're talking about topics related to migration, we need to situate our conversation with the lived experiences of migrants and refugees themselves. And so I draw on the work of a colleague, Janet Cleveland at McGill, who conducted a number of interviews with refugees who arrived in Canada via the Ocean Lady and Sunsea. And they describe things like being arrested and tortured, being pulled into mock executions, really quite horrendous experiences. One individual saying, "I witnessed carnage that I can never forget in my lifetime." And this is just a photograph of what was going on in Sri Lanka at the time. So these cases end up wending their way to the Supreme Court of Canada because these individuals on the boats were both charged and denied access to Canada's refugee program. Speaking about the case of one young man, B306 as he was called, he was involved in cooking meals for the crew, performing lookout duties in exchange for food. He had no role in planning or organizing the trip. He was hungry and in poor health when he boarded the ship. And yet, Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board found him culpable of people smuggling, found that it was irrelevant whether he himself was a refugee claimant and was not regarded as a member of the crew. There was no distinction between actual people smugglers and the people who aid them. Similarly, government lawyers framed the necessity of people smuggling offenses in the context of Canada's border control and border security, and argued in favor of criminalizing the mutual aid that B306 was involved. Government counsel argued that he was no longer a smuggled migrant himself, but rather an integral part of the smuggling operation for doing these activities. He actively assisted in the smuggling of others, government counsel suggested. Well, what did the Supreme Court have to say about all this? Interestingly, it was a resounding victory for the refugees. The court affirmed the right to seek and enjoy asylum is not displaced by acts of mutual aid and solidarity. And they said it in clear text. I'm not going to read these out, but basically 2 companion cases really stated definitively that the crime of people smuggling doesn't extend to permitting prosecution for simply helping your family or providing humanitarian or mutual aid to undocumented entrants. The court went on to say that would depart from the balance struck in the smuggling protocol, right? So very strong language. The second companion case, we see very similar language in relation to the inadmissibility provisions. The court concluding that it's the intention of the protocol was not to exclude the activities of those who provided support for humanitarian reasons. So the court's affirming mutual aid, and we can think of that as a very strong. Whoops! What just happened? I've lost my screen. Have you guys lost it?
We still can see the end of the PowerPoint. So maybe if you just come back to.
Oh. Yeah, hold on. It's totally knocked me out. I don't know why.
These things always happen.
Yeah. So you can see my application, but I can't. Okay. Whoops. Okay. And I know I'm running out of time. So you know what I'm going to do? Yeah, I'm going to just try one more time. Do you see it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just at the very end. And what I want to talk about is the aftermath of these court cases. On the one hand, victory. You have the Supreme Court of Canada emphasizing that mutual aid is not illegal. And that, when it comes to refugee mutual aid, people should not be prosecuted. People should not be barred from accessing the refugee determination system. But what happens in the aftermath? Well, the Canadian government gives the Thai government $7 million to combat human smuggling and crack down on illegal migration. The funds included money to train police, as well as immigration and border patrol officers. And a comprehensive interdiction strategy ensured that no more Tamil boat people were able to access asylum in Canada by boats. Sri Lankan Tamil refugees fortunate enough to access the assistance of the UNHCR in Bangkok join a very long queue as they wait for resettlement for years to a third country. And more critically, a comprehensive but relatively clandestine migrant smuggling prevention strategy initiated by the federal government, this time a liberal federal government, continues to finance interception activities in countries with poor human rights records. So despite the legal victory, we actually see the government circumventing the dicta of the courts and through non-legal means enhance its interdiction strategy. So if you look at where we are today, by the end of 2021, there were over 26.6 million refugees worldwide, the highest numbers on record, and these numbers don't include the Ukrainian crisis. Yet for 2022, Canada's resettlement target is approximately 52,000 in a context of an immigration intake of over 400,000. So we kind of see where Canada's priorities are. And my final slide is really to raise some questions. and to leave with you in the discussion, I hope. And it's this: would a genuine international system of responsibility sharing for refugee protection eliminate the efforts by states, especially in the global north, to criminalize and prosecute refugee mutual aid and solidarity practices? Many people point to that as the solution. What do you think? If so, what would or should such a system look like? And a number of scholars have weighed in on this before. These are not new questions. In the absence of an international response, what are the cautionary lessons of the Canadian experience? More specifically, what are the risks of launching rights-based claims in court in relation to refugee mutual aid and escape aid, given what we've seen in the Canadian context? So that's it, and I look forward to having some more discussion about this later.
Thank you so much, Sharry. It was very interesting. I don't know, Iker, are you ready? I don't know if you have a PowerPoint to share.
Yes.
So I'll leave the floor to you.
Here I go. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Camille and Marty, for invitation to join this wonderful series of seminars. Thank you also to Border Criminology, so to the CNETS network. I think we all follow Border Criminology's blog and YouTube channel and everything. So it's a really exhausting or very interesting session today. What I'm going to present here, it's a part of several research projects we conducted. One was led by Ana López Sala about non-state actors in the migration control industry. And the other one I led recently finished on transit migrants across the Basque country, all through Spain towards Europe. And well, some of the findings of some of the main points I will raise today have already been published in one article we published together with Ana López Sala in the European Journal of Criminology, specifically about crimmigration of activism in Spain. But the second, maybe smaller part, because it's an ongoing project line, will refer to the Basque, meaning the Spanish and French internal European border. I will deal with that in the last part of my presentation, but they are only preliminary findings that we are analyzing at this moment, and we will hopefully publish soon. So let me start with some kind of quick literature review, because when we wanted to approach this field of the criminalization of activists, we found out that there was, yes, we all love to read those texts on control of irregular migration, the legal categorization and social construction of irregular migrants, and more recently, well, not much recent, but the criminalization studies that we all looked and enjoyed reading. But there was not much about what happens with activists who are in the field of defending migrants' rights. Of course, we find there's a big literature in social movements talking about all kind of criminalization of social movements, of dissents, of how police deal with protests. But there was very few articles or books or whatever talking about the specific field of migrants' rights activism. So we decided to, using the Spanish case, to have a look what's happening and try to classify it, because there's not one single way of criminalization of activism, but there are different levels, as I will mention in the last part of my presentation. As I said, we've done research field work in Spain, and I'm doing now in France. I will mention some legal rules like laws, criminal code, even municipal ordinances that are also very important. We've interviewed people, with activists, we've visited the cities, meaning that we've participated in demonstrations and kind of mass meetings or assemblies. And we had the opportunity to analyze some specific, I would say, legal documents, meaning that some of them were fined with economic sanctions. We had the opportunity also to have a look at them. So let's start with the Spanish, very quick. I'm not going to go into big detail with the Spanish legal background. You can find it with more detail in the article I mentioned. But we need to divide to understand at least two main blocks, or two main areas. First is the criminalization of migrants that have started 1985 when Spain joined, or was up to join the European Union or the European community at that time. And Spain, although it wasn't an immigration country, was forced to elaborate an immigration law where it already introduced situations of irregular migration and even support or the punishment of smuggling. Later laws also punished not only irregularity with deportation, but also removed rights of migrants related to political mobilization, to political activism. So migrants in a regular situation could not exercise political rights in order to denounce their situation. This is kind of similar or parallel situation with the criminalization of all activism. Well, the sanction for promoting irregular or favoring irregular migration was introduced in the 1995 Criminal Code and is kept until today. But also we need to look at security laws. Meaning that how police can repress, detain actions that could be related to the denounce or to the protest in order to defend migrants' rights. It's relevant to mention how in the last security law, it's a law of security, how it is used by the government to legalize the pushbacks. Legalize, I mean, they were already happening, and probably you've heard about them in Ceuta and Melilla, in the south of the north of Africa, to Spanish cities. It was illegal, or it was denounced as illegal, but then the Spanish, this is security law legalized, and then it's the European Court of Human Rights that first condemned Spain, but in the second instance recognized the legality of these pushbacks. But still, social movements, lawyers and academic researchers, we still consider that it's an illegality not to recognize the claim of asylum or even to deport without any protection or legal advice back to Morocco. And finally, we need to mention that the last criminal code, where apparently decriminalizing some acts, in the end, what the government pretended is to take it back to the administrative field, where you all know that always the place where administration and police move with much more discretion in the moment. When we need more guarantees, activists can be detained more or less for some hours or a couple of days or without any judicial intervention. So in the end, I don't know if it's better to keep them in the criminal code or the other way around. So.
Oh, sorry, Iker, can I just say something? I think your PowerPoint is not working. I have had a few messages. I think we're still on page 1. Now it works. Yes.
Well, I will leave it like that. I will try. Sorry for that.
No worries.
Thank you for the message. Well, you have this that's not working for me. I will do it like this so I can change the slides. Well, and now let me bring some quick examples of the criminalization of activism in Spain. What we did in the article as a way of shortening the text, we decided it was interesting to talk about the external border, the internal borders, but also the externalized borders. Meaning that if we have a look, as I mentioned in the last slide, talking about Ceuta and Melilla, well, those places where the violation of migrants' rights is constant. We need to bring the work of Protein, the organization Protein, and José Palazón. You've probably seen some of his pictures. Pictures that were used before the European Court of Human Rights. And what this kind of activists suffer is like, well, he's constantly threatened by the police, taken to the police station, arrested, and even his camera has been confiscated several times for months. Maybe finally he recovers them, but the damage somehow is the damage, not only also not only physical damage or whatever, but also economic damage. Then we need to mention the internal controls. Those activists like Brigadas Vecinales, that is fighting against police raids in the streets, mainly in Madrid, in some neighborhoods of Madrid, that they are being identified, sued or sanctioned with hundreds and thousands of euros. We can also mention Paremos los Vuelos against deportation flights, whose actions are also repressed in Oviedo mainly. And in the city of Barcelona, we can find Tancamps Alciers, who also are part of this kind of coercion and threats. And finally, you probably heard of Helena Malino. She's a quite active activist she's Spanish activist based in Morocco. I think, well, probably she was deported. She was expelled from Morocco. Her job was and still is to get in contact migrants that are somehow lost in the sea, and she contacts with Spanish maritime rescue, indicates their position through the GPS, and so that the Spanish public service can go and rescue them. And for this task, she was prosecuted by the Moroccan judiciary. No, and then we knew that she was intended to be processed in Spain, but the court decided it wasn't something illegal what she was doing. So somehow it was this accusation sent to the Moroccan government, and she spent some time before the court with that. At least she was scared about that. So finally she was released, but Morocco several times expelled her from Morocco. These are not the only cases. You all know that when we do lists, we risk leaving people outside, but there are many other activists in Spain, photographers, journalists, and activists like Helena Malino, that individually or collectively are somehow criminalized for their job. Now, allow me to turn the focus into my
Iker, can I just intervene one last time? There's about 30 seconds remaining, so I'm just
yes, I will do it very quickly. Thank you. The Basque border, meaning the border between Spain and France, has recently become a very active border, especially, you all know, because France has reintroduced the border. And I must say that in the Spanish side, activists haven't been much criminalized, apart from being interviewed by the police in the streets. What are you doing? What are you taking? Where are you taking these migrants? We are taking them from the bus stop to the hostel. it has happened in the French side that many activists have been not only stopped by the police but also detained and taken to the police stations at least for one night. And as you can see in this picture, it's not only police but also the military that is acting in France. So I like you can all see these sentences or these words. I'm not a trafficker, but I'm a citizen who acts as in solidarity. Thank you very much. We don't have much time, but I'm pleased. I'm very happy I had the time to talk with all of you. And I'm happy to answer any questions or comments that you would like to pose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iker. So Witold, we can pass on to you.
Thank you very much, Camille. Vitek and I, we have prepared our presentation together. If you don't mind, I will start speaking, but then I'll give the floor to Vitek, and then I'll come back with a few examples. Vitek, we can't see anything. Yeah, yeah. And now I think we need to do full screen.
So okay. So let's start, and I'm trying with this presentation because I hope it works.
Yes, perfect. Sharry has said in her presentation that the Polish-Ukrainian border looks so much different than a lot of other borders that we currently see in the world. But Vitek and I, in our talk today, we want to take you to the very same border, but a couple of 100 kilometers to the north, to the Polish-Belarusian border, where we have seen since 2021, since summer 2021, a crisis developing, which stands in complete contrast to how open and how welcoming the Polish-Ukrainian border is these days. Vitek will give you an introduction to the situation at the border in the next slide, to how the situation has developed and what has developed. And we're going to frame our talk in the context of criminalization of solidarity in Poland, because the situation at the Polish-Belarusian border really stands as a case in point how divided Poland currently is in terms of its migration and refugee policy, and how two examples from a complete opposite end of the spectrum are happening within the same border. So Vitek, over to you.
Thank you. So I will start with a short description of the crisis. As Agnieszka has said, it started in summer 2021. And it started with a strain that a group of Afghani people, as you see at the top of this slide, at the very border and surrounded by, on the one hand, Polish border guards, on the other hand, Belarusian border guards, and they spent them there like about a month. We don't know exactly how long they stayed, because since some period of time, and I will talk about it later, the border was cut off from any public view. So it started with this surrounding of this group, but very immediately there were some other groups that were crossing the border with kids, with men and females, And all those people were stopped and, by Polish border guard and expelled immediately from the country, of course, without any procedure. So it was kind of pushbacks, but I prefer the term of illegal collective expulsion. I think it's much better explains the situation. So asylum claims remained unheard by Polish authorities. Every single person was stopped and then driven to the border. Those pictures are from summer, but let me show you how the border looks like at the moment, and let me present you some video. I don't. So now you see the forests like it looks right now. There are the things that people left behind. And what activists do actually is to approach them in the forest, provide them with the food, with the warm clothes, with some information about the legal situation that is almost non-existent actually in Poland. Some people are picked up from the forest by some. One call it smugglers, why call it facilitators or entrepreneurs who facilitate the further journey to the Western countries, like to Germany. So the work of activists is to approach them, to serve, to provide them with any means that they need to. Sometimes also to shelter them in their homes, especially in winter time. The biggest group that is providing this assistance is called Grupa Granica in Poland, so border group. And of course, those groups are subjected to some harassment by our Polish enforced agencies. The criminalization of solidarity in this paper will see as a harassment of activists or NGOs by different state representatives or by other groups with unknown groups, but with the support with the enforced agencies or without a prevention or intervention to prevent such an incident. It includes stop and search initiatives, but also in opening criminal investigation and indictments of activists. The two main legal avenues to criminalize activists are organization of illegal border crossing, like human smuggling, as Sharry explained it earlier on, and facilitation of illegal state. Both of them are, of course, introduced to Polish legislation because of some international obligation. But as you see from it's a quote from European Commission guidance on the facilitation directive. The spirit of those provisions is very clear, and it's said that it's not be constructed as a way to allow human activity to be criminalized. But of course, it is the situation there. So some tips from Poland how to criminalize solidarity. First, it's very handy if you close the space and keep it far from a public eye. That's why, for example, Polish authorities declared state of exception on the 2nd of September last year, which is still ongoing during along the Polish-Belarusian border. So they created a 3 kilometers wide zone with only local residents could enter and or other people who work there, and there is no media presence allowed there. Of course, there is no humanitarian aid provided there. The government doesn't provide any humanitarian aid to people who are trapped in those woods. The second step is kind of attempt of legalization of collection expulsion. Attempt because of course they cannot be legalized, but in Polish law there are some provisions that seem or that for enforcement agency seems like to be a legal background for their practices. This goes hand in hand and with long-lasting problems with rule of law or problems in Poland and subordination of the police and prosecutors and to some extent courts to the government. Then, of course, the space could be militarized. So Polish border was saturated by military. 15,000 uniformed officers from different forces was present then, but despite that, number of people have managed to cross the border and find a way up to German border. It was like 12,000 people already reported on Polish-German border. And the proper narration should be created. Of course, it's not new. It has been present on the European level and the level of the country like Italy or France or Austria. But Polish authorities jumped on the same bandwagon and try to initiate the fear against migrants to create this image of a violent, non-white man, and to prevent activist work described them as insane dreamers or unpatriotic or ideology-driven lunatics. Agnieszka, over to you.
Thank you. For those who, what Witold has described, for those of you who do not know the Polish context, the majority of the people who arrived through the Polish-Belarusian border in Poland, they are from the Middle East, they are from Kurdistan in North Iraq, they are from Afghanistan, they are from Syria. People may ask, how did they find themselves in Belarus? Of course, this was a state smuggling by the Belarusian dictator, Lukashenko, who sponsored visas for these categories of migrants, allowed them to come to Belarus. And then upon the expiry of the visas, his border guards basically pushed them across the Polish border, promising them that you will now find yourself in the EU, very short walk, and you will be in Germany, and you can ask for asylum there. This play by Lukashenko, and both Witold and I have written about this, and in the first or the second slide, you had links to our pieces, the short pieces on it. This steps by Lukashenko did not take away from the Polish authorities the fact that Poland is member and is a party to the Refugee Convention, and everybody who crosses the border to Poland has a right to apply for asylum. So how did the activists about whose criminalization are we talking in this presentation found themselves there at the border? They found themselves at the border because the Polish border guards, who are normally entrusted with accepting the asylum applications, like Witold just said, refused to do so. They refused to do so and instead engaged in the practice of mass expulsions, of pushbacks, and illegal collective expulsions, like Witold said. So Witold presented the legal environment that was there, and it was quite often used or threatened to be used against the activists who found themselves at the border to provide some form of humanitarian help and legal help to the people who were forced by Lukashenko across the Polish-Belarusian border. So what we have in my part now, what I want to say is that even though the law about illegal border crossing and about aiding illegal migration is there, we have seen so far a very, very weak enforcement of that law. We have seen that activists were arrested and indicted, but the courts refused to detain them. Once the case reached the court said, you must be joking, we will not order the detention of those people. The second is that the journalists were cleared from any charges of entering the so-called the extraterritorial zone. And here you see, unfortunately in Polish, but there's a screenshot from a recent judgment from the 18th of January 2022, which a number of journalists who, I think French journalists who found themselves in the zone of exclusion, they were arrested completely disproportionately. They had to spend a night in prison. The Supreme Court has basically cancelled the previous judgment and declared them innocent, and has passed the costs of the legal investigation back to the state. So basically, the Polish state now has to pay all the legal proceedings. As very recently, I think it was happened yesterday, Witold's colleague, Witold, if you could actually stay a bit on that previous slide. Witold's colleague, a lawyer, Małgorzata Jaźwińska, she scored a hat-trick before the local court. I'm going to call it a hat-trick. I mean, my son plays football, so I hope the hat-trick is an understandable metaphor. So she's called a hat-trick where the courts found that a detention and pushback of her clients, three Afghani nationals, was not only unlawful, but also unjustified and procedurally incorrect. Yes, procedurally incorrect. So following from this, I would say, rather hopeful judgments of the Polish court, and we have to say, as Witold already mentioned, we are working in a state which is engulfed in a rule of law crisis since the last 7 years. We are looking at a really hopeful hopeful judgment. But it also means that those judgments, if we follow Weber says that state has the monopoly for using violence legitimately, yes? But those court judgments are basically taking away the legitimacy of that violence from the state. So this legitimacy is now, the courts say that whatever you do in prosecuting the activists is basically illegal. So when the courts remove the legitimacy, the state's use of violence is what really stays. And Vitek, if you could make the next slide, this leads to our second part of this talk, where we want to say that the unintended consequences of criminalization of solidarity in that particular crisis leads to social acceptance of violence against human activists. And I would say a rise of vigilante, non-state and state violence against the human rights activists. And here I want to show to you very briefly 3 case studies. Vitek, if we could move to the next slide. This was Medics at the Border, a very local group organized, something like Médecins Sans Frontières, but this was a locally Polish fundraised group of medics who went to the border. You have to remember this crisis started in summer 2021, but then winter in Poland already starts in October. It gets extremely cold. Lots of the people who were intercepted at the border by the Polish activists, they were in a deep state of hypothermia. Some of their temperature was well below 30 degrees. So this group of medics was really needed in order to ensure that the first aid is somehow delivered to the people. And here on the second picture, I don't know whether you can see, but this is basically an ambulance that has been hired by this group of medics, drawing on funding that has been procured by you and me, citizens. And its tires have been slashed. Yeah, its tires have been slashed. So basically, they arrived after helping a group of refugees in the forest, arrived at the car, at the ambulance, and they noticed that the tires have been slashed. And this was only a prelude, because Vitek, if you could look to the next, then they found out that their private cars have been smashed. So these are pictures, credit to their Facebook group, but this is basically once they were just about to finish the term at the border. They arrived with the private cars, and this is how those cars looked in the morning. They of course contacted the police, and the police is still investigating. But basically, why this happened is because there was the narrative that Vitek was telling you about earlier has created a form of social acceptance that these people who are helping refugees, they're just crazy. They are against the state. They don't understand. They are playing into Lukashenko's a horrible plan against people smuggling into Poland, rather than seeing them as who they are, refugees with the right to apply for asylum. Vitek, the next slide. Here, again, it's a situation of Witold's colleague, actually, from Grupa Granica, from the border group, a translator, Jacob, who was going to help a group to translate from Arabic when they wanted to submit the asylum application, and he was literally pulled out from his car, put on the ground, and beaten up by a group of thugs. He has reported it to the police, but again, the investigation is still ongoing. And the very last slide shows how journalists' access to the zone has been limited. So on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of journalists whose equipment has been taken away from them. It has been put on the ground. They have been handcuffed completely disproportionately. And once they've been released and they complained of the pattern of the bruises from the handcuffs. They've been told by the border guards who have detained them, don't worry, this is not from the handcuffs. You've just probably were wearing your watch a little bit too tightly. So you can see the level of cynicism that normally would not be allowed. And yet, on the left-hand side, you can see a formal interview given to one of the major Polish news outlets by the superiors, by the legal superiors of the border guards who did this to the journalists, saying that, oh, they absolutely acted within the law. There's nothing we can do here. The journalists were simply not supposed to be there where they were, and this is the lot that would happen to them. So as you can see, Vitek and I are thinking, we're just going to close with this really 3 examples, but that demonstrates that when the state criminalizes solidarity and the courts remove the legitimacy for that criminalization, that can have the unintended consequences of social acceptance of violence, which under normal circumstances would not meet that social acceptance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vitek and Agnieszka. It was super interesting. I saw that we had one question in the chat, so maybe we can start with that question by Remy T. So his question is, mutual aid suggests that both parties can help each other. For example, I will buy your grocery because you are isolating, and one day you may do the same, kind of. In the case of migration, one side has less power, so displaced people, than the other side, citizens. So it's not so much mutual. How can we recognize this asymmetric relation between migrants or asylum seekers and citizens that are helping them, while making sure it doesn't end up in what some will call white saviorism or voluntarism? I don't know, Sharry, if you were talking about mutual aid, maybe you can start, and feel free to add anything else whenever you want for the other speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Remy, for the important question. I'll begin by acknowledging that I am not a scholar of mutual aid, but certainly have been a practitioner of mutual aid. And I'll answer your question by drawing on the work of others, not my own work. And I think, first and foremost, people like Regan de Loggins, who wrote a piece last year called The Co-option of Mutual Aid, and again, Dean Spade, who has a new book out on mutual aid. And I think the risk you're pointing to is a real one, but it's important to understand that it's not, mutual aid isn't predicated on immediate reciprocity. Instead, it's predicated on the value of sharing between ordinary people, acknowledging that there are absolutely asymmetries of power, but that this sharing goes on outside of the structures of capitalism and colonial authority. And it is not about charity so much as supporting each other. So, you know, you're quite right. When we talk about refugee mutual aid, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable displaced non-citizens on the spectrum of vulnerability, who will not be in a position to immediately turn the tables. But that's not really the point. That's not how we evaluate it. Mutual aid is really about a process of decentering and a process of resisting the very structures that cause the problem in the first place. So, you know, 100%, you know, you can run to the Polish-Ukrainian border with a white savior ethos and not be part of the solution. But you can also be at the border in an effort to resist the structures that cause the problem in the first place. So, you know, I think we have to do a bit of a deeper dive in both the scholarship on mutual aid and the practice of mutual aid to understand that it's not about me buying your groceries today and you buying them tomorrow, because the reciprocity we're talking about is really a much more kind of fundamental principle than it is an immediate exchange. So I'll stop there. I'm sure my co-panelists will have something to offer as well.
Iker or Vitek or Agnieszka, do you want to react as well? Iker
Well,
moving.
maybe I can only add that in the context I am doing research, it's much a context of transit, meaning that migrants most of the time, specifically, for example, in the border to France, migrants want to cross as fast as possible. So they rarely join local groups. And even imagine it's difficult even to do legal complaints before the courts, because migrants want to cross. So there's no chance for mutual correlation, mutual protest. So it's a very specific context that there's very little time or chance to engage together.
Thank you.
May I add
Vitek.
something? Yeah. I mean, not about so much mutual, but the solidarity between different nations. I mean, we are now in the process of preparation some statement from Ukrainian organization in Poland, and Ukrainians will receive so much help, as you know, all know from Polish authorities, and they are against the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border. So they are now drafting some letter to the authorities that show the support for people on Belarusian borders and support for the ones who are not met with not only with open arms, but with such a harsh violence, especially that now what we see at the border is a lot of young people, like kids. The last week we saw a kid just 40 days old who were put back to Belarus. There is a lot of people with disabilities, with ill people. So because the Lukashenko regime tried to empty their warehouses, so the Belarusian authorities pushed away every single person from the territory.
Thank you, Vitek. I also want to actually go back to the question that Sharry asked, because I don't think, unless there are direct questions from the audience, if so, please raise your hand or just turn on your microphone and ask. I see a question coming in. So Lena, hi Lena, good that you're here as well. I'm going to ask Lena's question first, and then I have Sherry's question that I would also like to ask the question. Lena says, thank you for excellent presentations. I would like to ask about the issue of deficits of justice and fairness in criminal justice processes. Numerous prosecutions, as Agnieszka and Vitek and also Iker highlighted, are ending up in dismissals. However, if the aims are to bar or preclude solidarity with refugees and migrants, they still seem quite successful to achieve these aims with the prosecution alone. How do you see this being challenged? Who wants to react to that? Yes, please, Agnieszka.
I think this is a $1 million question. I think it's $1 million question because your question really alludes to something I struggle with. I mean, law is not in a vacuum. Law is a social instrument. I mean, there is I mean, tons of articles have been written about the co-constitutive force of the law and society, the relationship, which way goes causality, etc., etc. And I think, pardon, but the jury is still out on this. So to me, this fact that even though the prosecutions result in dismissals, they still send a very powerful message. They still send a very powerful social message that violence against activists is something we do here, is socially acceptable. That we will be there to prosecute it. I mean, this is very soon in Poland will evolve in a situation that the courts are not right. The courts are corrupt. Our government is doing everything to change the courts. I mean, the courts are non-democratic, of course. We have seen these debates in the UK around Brexit, judges being the traitors of the people, etc., etc. These are very much the debates that you can hear now in Poland when the judiciary and other rule of law activists are pushing against the changes into the justice system by the current government. And of course, migration it's not immune to those debates. That is something that, I mean, really sparks my interest in Poland, how the rule of law crisis engulfs other social spheres, and how, despite the fact that maybe the judges are pushing back against, this still sends a very powerful social message that the violence is okay. So sorry for not,
because I have a kind of different view on that. I mean, not necessarily, but from at a different level. Because from my perspective, what is going on is it's showing the weakness of the state. Actually, they try to stop activists, so they do whatever they can to stop them, to harass them, to impose this twinning effect on them. But it's not happening. And they actually failing to stop to stop people delivering humanitarian aid. And they are not very supported. I mean, the state and the action of the authorities are not very supported by the general society. Of course, on this piece of land, we could see some vigilante activities, as Agnieszka presented, and no one knows who those vigilantes are. Actually, I mean, they could be local residents. They could be also, and we think that there is also a case, members of the military in Poland. They just during their leisure time, they do just this vigilante activity. So no one knows who are they. But the general support is not on the side of the government in those actions. So from my perspective, it's a bit different. And another angle is there that the courts do not bring any support for from the legal point of view. So this additional element here.
Thank you, Witold. Iker, would you also want to react to that? Because you also talked about this.
Yes, please. Well, thank you. I didn't have much time to explain the French situation now, but as I said, most of the activists detained this recently, this last week or a couple of weeks ago, the worst punishment they are getting is to spend the night in the police station. But if we look, I didn't have much time to explain the French legal framework. I didn't have time to explain how the French Conseil d'État, the State Council, some years ago recognized the principle of fraternity beyond the crime of solidarity, and it was in the context of the trial against Cédric Roux, an activist, a former activist that helps migrants in the French side of the Alps, in the French-Italian border. And well, this would challenge the whole system in France, the whole system of criminalization of France. And now the principle of solidarity maybe is preventing the Basque activists from being kept into the detention facilities for more than one night. And once the police, the PAF, the police of frontier, discovers that they are doing this job of taking people from the border to the main or the next big city where the hostel is, they are doing this for activism and not for profit. Some time ago, maybe they will be kept for more days or even taken before courts. But one of the sentences, I don't know if you had the chance to read it, is the official prosecutor in Bayona, in the city, said that we cannot do more because we can see that it's for activism, it's for free what they are doing, it's not for profit, so we cannot do more.
Thank you very much. Sharry, would you want to add something?
I don't think not right now, thanks.
Then we're going to actually pick up on the question that you posed at the end of your presentation to sort of start the discussion, which I think is an interesting question to also ask the other panelists to react to, but maybe you would also want to give your thoughts on it, because I think asking the question comes from a place where you probably have thought about it yourself. Just to refresh everybody's memory, your question to keep in mind was, would a genuine international system of responsibility sharing for refugee protection eliminate the efforts by states, especially states in the global north, to criminalize and prosecute refugee mutual aid and solidarity practices? And if so, what would such a system look like? Would you want to maybe share your thoughts on that first, Sharry?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start by saying it wouldn't look like, with all due respect, the regime proposed by my former mentor and colleague, Jim Hathaway, who was very involved in proposing a sort of system of temporary protection that he touted as the best hope for an international system of refugee responsibility sharing. That proposal really never had any legs, and I think primarily was too much of a compromise for people who are committed to a world with greater freedom of movement, if not entirely free movement. It was too much of a compromise. I think if we were able to dream up a world where people actually had the right to free movement, there wouldn't be a need to prosecute this kind of activity, right? But we're a long way from getting there. That's the problem. And I think the best that can be achieved is at a local level right now. And I guess I would say that at the end of the day, the argument for freer movement is a practical argument. And I really, in that regard, draw on the work of my friends, Nandita Sharma and Cynthia Wright and Bridget Anderson. I think it's a vision we have to hold very clearly. But to get there, we've got to work locally. And to the extent that we can make some strides locally, we'll be able to help our governments appreciate that the costs of criminalizing solidarity are just too high, right? And are stupid, but we're not there yet. So I guess my answer is very theoretical, but on the other hand, it's what drives my own activism, a commitment that we have to move the dial on this stuff. And the best way to move the dial is not by selling out the vision, right? It's by keeping that vision very center in the work that we do. So that's my start.
Thank you. It's a good start. Iker, Agnieszka, Witold, maybe somebody from the audience would want to react, but I'm looking at the other panelists first. I saw some nodding, deep thinking.
If I may, I fully agree with Sharry on that note. And I mean, what makes me anxious actually is that movement to build walls on the border, especially it's visible in Europe, but not only there. And because my question is, what will be the next step? If we have the movement, the walls, and they are not working, and it's clear, it's clear. We'll see that. So what we do next to protect ourselves from migration, and that is that is something that I really afraid of, and I don't think that anyone thinks about it in a political sphere. I mean, if they are so strongly focused on protection, they don't have any other moves except of some lethal forces or a weapon being deployed at the border. And I don't think any one of us want to be part of that, and then want to see ourselves, because it will be all our own names done. So, I mean, this is my biggest fear there.
Thank you, Witold. Iker or Agnieszka.
I have before the situation started with the war in Ukraine. Of course, it is such a defining moment and such a groundbreaking moment that yes, we started already now temporarily divide the time, at least in history of to the war and after the war or until the war. I think. When we were talking about the crisis and trying to garner the media attention and the public opinion attention about what is happening at the Polish-Belarusian border, I think it was quite difficult, and the dominant narrative was that refugees are weaponized by Lukashenko. So again, a narrative that would not recognize right to asylum, yes, that would not recognize Article 31 of the Refugee Convention, that refugees should not be punished for illegal border crossing. And then somebody said this, and actually I need to give due reference to that. It was Nando Sigona from Birmingham who said that if we were to now put forward an instrument like the 1951 Refugee Convention, it would not be binding. States would not sign up to it. It would be very wishy-washy, something to the effect like the Global Compact. So signed, but not necessarily enforceable. So my heart is totally with Sharry and with Witold. I actually, I'm sorry for bringing this rather realist perspective that I think, given the current politicization of migration, the way it has been vilified in the public discourse, the way political capitals have made on criminalization of migration, criminalization of solidarity, I fear at the moment that the best instrument we have is the 1951 Refugee Convention, and yet states are already derogating from it to whatever they can. And the next type of accord like this, I would not see in the foreseeable future. Again, why I started about the war in Ukraine, because that has changed something. We have seen the Temporary Protection Directive in the EU being activated almost immediately. And that's a temporary protection directive that has been on EU's legal books since 2001. It has been put in place in the aftermath of the Balkan conflict and the mass displacement there. And the very fast ratification or pinging, okay, let's use this instrument now, shows to me that yes, but do we really need it? Why the temporary protection directive could not be implemented in 2015 when we have people dying across the Mediterranean, when we have people trying to make it from Turkey to Greece and dying in the Aegean Sea there? Why it takes the blatant bare force of Putin attacking sovereign Ukraine to make European leaders to actually implement that mechanism. So again, I know I've been taught you shouldn't answer a question with another question, but I think I'm just going to leave it there.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I think it's a very important addition and giving lots of food for thought. Iker, I see you're also opening your mic.
Yeah, I would like to continue this last idea of how the European Union is reacting at the present situation. Of course, the Ukrainian situation is completely different to many other mobilities derived from wars or from other dramatic situations. Let's think of the Syrian mobilization of people coming to Europe, or even the continuous African people coming from the south. But I agree that not only the Convention on Refugee would not be passed, also the European Charter of Human Rights and many other legal binding human rights texts passed in the 1950s wouldn't be accepted now. Let's think on the last sentences of the European Court of Human Rights, saying that people jumping the fences in Ceuta and Melilla do not have rights because of their action was illegal. This goes against, and in that sense, they cannot claim for asylum. They don't have rights for a lawyer, and meaning that it's the complete disposition of rights of people. They are not committing crimes. I mean, and even though criminals do have rights, so I don't think I cannot be positive to the situation. I hope the time changes, but it's not time for being optimistic in the European Union. At least if we look at institutions, I'm not saying that we need to be optimistic and work in university, in collaboration with organizations, social movements, trying to change to make small changes in the courts, small administrative conflicts and so on. But if we look up, if we look at the Commission, the European Commission, if we look at the courts of the European Court of Human Rights, we cannot be too optimistic.
I unfortunately also agree with your rather, I would say, realist or even pessimistic point of view, Iker. Camille, I believe you have a last question for all our panelists, because we are close to 6 Dutch time, 5 UK time, noon, I think, Canadian time.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm just going to wrap this up with what just got said by everyone, and it's just to be a little bit more hopeful. So what's the way forward? Is strategic litigation the way forward? Is, as Iker said, small changes individually to make the most of our privilege and to help others? So maybe really quickly, everyone can say how we can really be actors of change and make our part, just to try to find a solution and end on a hopeful note.
So I'll jump in and say that, in my view, strategic litigation can never accomplish genuine transformation on its own. It's not to say it's not important to do. There's a role for it. Most often, court victories will not translate into fundamental change without social mobilization, right? So at best, test case litigation, like the kind I talked about in my presentation, it's a tool. It's an instrument, but it's not the battle. And I think the attention on social movements is really where we need to look for real change.
I mean, my idea fix recently is to change the narration that is around us, and I see the positive of it in Poland. I mean, when we talk about Belarusian crisis on Belarusian border, on now the aftermath of the war on Ukraine, the change of the narration, the shift of the narration, and show the positivity, show the need of help and the people who deserve help is something very powerful. And I see that I mean that is a very good start to change the law and to change the perception and to change the institutions, of course, there.
I agree with Sharry that not only courts are the only way to change. Or there's the need to combine both or multiple actions, both in the courts or in the streets, but also in other ways, creating transnational alliances with cross-border alliances, transcontinental alliances. Let's see the experience, the consolidated experience of Micro-Europe, meaning European and African alliances in the observation of borders. But last weekend we had a meeting, people coming from all around France, from the Alps, from Calais, here in the Basque country, sharing experiences that can lead to a later probably denounce of the situation in France of the internal borders and the criminalization of activism. So there are multiple, and I think it's not just one or the other. I think it's a combination of all of them.
Yeah, I would agree with the panelists wholeheartedly, and also say that if the history is to teach us anything, the big changes usually happened when the humanity fell down really, really low. And I mean now after the Second World War. And if this is any parallels to what we are seeing in Ukraine, once this war is finally over, I can see that maybe this will give push to maybe not adding new legal instruments, because I think they are there, but ensuring that they are used with the intentions within which they were originally constructed or put in place.
Well, I think that with this hopeful last words, This sums it up for a webinar. So I want to thank all of our speakers. It was very interesting to hear you today. I think that, yeah, a lot of points were made. So thank you to every one of you, and thank you for our audience. This will be recorded, so feel free to share the link once it's out. We will, I think, through Border Criminologies, try to send the link. And our next session, as Marcia just wrote in the chat, is on May 20th. So check our Border Criminologies website for further information. Thank you, everyone. It was great to hear from you.
Thank you, Camille, and thank you, Marcia, for organizing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.